China has a long and established history of borrowing or outright stealing designs, technologies, and even whole aircraft from its competitors. And there's evidence to suggest that their Chengdu J-20 Mighty Dragon, the nation's first stealth fighter, is more of the same. But for all those guys out there saying it's just a ripoff of the F-22, trust me when I tell you it's a bit more complicated than that. Let's dive into the J-20's DNA. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. The Chengdu J-20 Mighty Dragon was the world's first non-American stealth platform to ever enter operational service, effectively ending Uncle Sam's 34-year monopoly on low observability that stretched all the way back to 1983. As the J-20 entered service, many within both the United States and Russia accused the People's Republic of China of stealing their stealth fighter designs to hurry their own jet into service. There is certainly evidence and historical precedent to back up these assertions, but the J-20 doesn't look exactly like any other fifth-generation entry. Here's the thing though, that doesn't mean it's an entirely original design, and there's a fair amount of evidence to suggest that the reason why the J-20 looks different is because it incorporates borrowed or stolen elements from at least 3 different advanced fighter programs across 2 different nations, alongside some home-baked Chinese technology as well. But before we delve deeper into that, let's talk a bit about China's history of outsourcing fighter designs, either through legitimate purchases or more covert and less reputable means, so that you can appreciate the historical precedent in play when we're talking about the J-20. China's rapid military expansion and modernization have come as a result of a massive economic and political effort. The nation's military, once a sprawling mess of nepotism and corruption, has quickly become one of, if not the dominant military force in much of the Pacific, with more than 770 sizable vessels and a growing stockpile of highly capable missile systems, much of which is devoted to defending their claims of sovereignty over the entirety of the South China Sea. Now, I don't want to overstate China's military capabilities. They still lack a lot of really important things, like qualified carrier strike group commanders or a blue water navy in general. But they have certainly overcome some significant challenges in a very short amount of time. And if you take a closer look at many of China's larger defense initiatives, it becomes clear that their rapid progress has come, in no small part, thanks to an absolutely massive espionage apparatus that's devoted to culling technical secrets from anyone, including trade partners and friendly nations. And few fields better demonstrate this knack for advancement through theft than Chinese military aviation. I could do an entire video, and in fact I have written entire articles about Chinese aircraft and the American or Russian fighters that they were originally based on. But let's run through just a few quick examples for the sake of historical perspective. China's J-10 fighter program benefited directly from purchasing information from Israel about their defunct Lavi fighter, which was itself largely based on America's F-16. China's J-11 and subsequent J-16 are both based on the Soviet Su-27 after China purchased a production line in 1989. The Soviets did not want to sell it to them, but this was 2 years before their government would collapse, and their economic desperation really sort of forced their hand. But there was a time when Moscow said no, and China just straight up went around them. And that's the case of the J-15, which is China's current primary carrier-based fighter. When Russia refused to sell them the production line for the Su-33, they just went to Ukraine and purchased one of the fighter prototypes for them to reverse engineer for themselves. There are, of course, other examples, as well as examples from other industries. China has long understood that in order to compete with and eventually overtake the most capable military forces on the planet, they need to rapidly match those capabilities. And regardless of ethical considerations, the most cost-effective way to do that, whether we're talking tactics for carrier strike groups or designs for air superiority fighters, isn't to start from scratch, it's to purchase or steal everything you can get your hands on. Which brings us to the present day and China's J-20 Mighty Dragon, which has roots that date back all the way to the nation's JXX program back in the late 1990s. By 2008, about 11 years after the F-22 Raptor's first flight, Chengdu's Project 718 was chosen to move forward as the basis for the nation's first stealth fighter. But the design chosen would see significant revisions again in 2014 before being declared combat ready and put into production in 2017. And the folks who say the J-20 looks nothing like the F-22 aren't off base. The single-seat twin-engine fighter has a wingspan of a bit more than 42 feet, which is a little shy of the F-22's 44-foot wingspan, but an overall length of 69 feet 7 inches, which is significantly longer than the F-22's 62 feet. And of course, there are the canards sticking out of the fuselage forward of the wings, which you'll note are definitely not present on the F-22. China has struggled to field the jet's intended fifth-generation engines, known as the WS-15, which are expected to produce 44,000 pounds of thrust each. As a result, today's J-20s fly with either Russian-sourced AL-31s capable of pushing 33,000 pounds of thrust, or more recently China's homegrown equivalent, the WS-10C, capable of producing about the same. The J-20's top speed is listed as Mach 2, with a combat range of 1,100 nautical miles and a service ceiling of 66,000 feet. It's capable of carrying 4 medium or long-range missiles inside its primary payload bay, as well as 2 additional short-range air-to-air missiles in small secondary bays on either side of the fuselage. The J-20 is often compared to America's air superiority F-22, but technically speaking, it was designed to fill a different role. While the Raptor was always meant to dominate air combat, the J-20 was originally meant to fly deep into enemy territory to conduct strikes against ground targets, more akin to the F-35's mission set. But China has devoted considerable energy and resources to closing the air combat capability gap represented by the F-22, incorporating new systems like thrust vector control into the latest iterations of the J-20, the J-20B, in order to make it a more dynamic dogfighter. And while Americans were quick to point out similarities between the J-20 and America's F-22 and F-35, you should know that America wasn't the only nation to call China out when the J-20 was first unveiled, because Russia had something to say about it too. Although the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the new Russian government continued to work toward matching the air combat capabilities the US was developing in the F-22 throughout the rest of the decade in whatever capacity they could. While Sukhoi's PAK-FA ultimately won out, leading to the Su-57 Felon, Russia did consider at least 2 other potential stealth fighter designs, including the forward-swept-winged Su-47 and the Mikoyan MFI program's MiG-1.44 prototype, intended to result in the MiG-142 production fighter. The MiG-144 was revealed to the world in 1999, but actually began development in the 1980s. By 1994, the 144 prototype was conducting ground tests, but Mikoyan's financial woes at the time prevented the program from maturing any further. It would eventually take flight in February of 2000. While not as dramatic as the Su-47's pretty rad-looking backward wings, the MiG-144 also diverged dramatically from traditional Russian fighter designs by placing canards ahead of the rear-mounted wings, creating a strikingly similar layout to China's Mighty Dragon. And don't think for a moment that Russia hasn't noticed those similarities. In October of 2016, China officially unveiled its J-20 at an air show in Beijing, and within days, Russian state-owned media outlets were already calling them out. One of the most frequently cited statements in those early days came from the deputy editor of Russia's Arsenal of the Fatherland magazine, Dmitry Drozdenko. I'll quote him here. "In my opinion, the machine is based on the Russian MiG-144. That plane was created to compete with the PAK-FA at the preliminary design stage and made its maiden flight in 2000. The Chinese plane is very similar. Although it hasn't been announced officially, the J-20 uses our AL-31F engine, developed by Salute, which the Chinese bought for $500 million. But you guys know by now how little stock I put in statements in Russian state-owned media, but they weren't the only ones highlighting these similarities. Douglas Berry, an air warfare specialist at the London-based International Institute of Strategic Studies, also highlighted these similarities at the time. I'll quote him here. The back end of the J-20 looks awfully like the 144, as does the overall layout with delta canards. If it's a coincidence, it's a striking one. Russia may have provided technical support, but there's nothing substantial to prove that. China has, however, relied on Russia for much of its defense procurement for a decade and a half. In the years since, many within Russia and beyond have postulated that during Mikoyan's significant financial struggles in the late 90s, which ultimately led to a complete change in management, may have led them to sell some of their R&D to China, especially after it was becoming increasingly clear that the MiG-144 wasn't going to be Moscow's choice to move forward. And there is some evidence to back up this assertion. In August of 2011, Thomas Grove interviewed an unnamed source within Russia's defense industry for Reuters, who told him that Mikoyan did indeed help with the J-20's development, but that he wasn't sure it was done legally. I'll quote that unnamed source here. It looks like they got access to documents relating to the Mikoyan, the aircraft that the Ministry of Defense skipped over in its tender to create a stealth fighter. In order to further substantiate these claims, after all they did come from an anonymous source, Grove went and met with Russian defense analyst Adil Mukashev, who said that he knew for a fact it was true. He said, and I quote, "China bought the technology for parts, including the tail of the Mikoyan, for money." But I want to be clear that while the J-20 and the MiG-144 do bear a striking resemblance, there's also a number of very apparent differences. That, however, may not suggest a Chinese originality so much as a blending of stolen design elements. While the J-20's overall design may pull heavily from the MiG-144, its approach to defeating radar detection borrows more evidently from Lockheed Martin designs for the F-22 and the F-35. And while there remains some uncertainty about whether or not China really did get its hands on designs or materials from the MiG effort, there's no question at all about China's access to American stealth fighter plans. In August of 2014, a Chinese national living in Canada named Su Bin, who also often went by Steven Su, was arrested for leading a hacking effort to steal over 630,000 files from American aviation firms like Boeing and Lockheed Martin, all for the Chinese government. Their successful theft included F-22 and F-35 blueprints that would, and I quote, allow us, China, to catch up rapidly with US levels and stand easily on the giant's shoulders, according to Su Bin's own emails that were entered as evidence in his trial. While the J-20 looks most like the MiG-144 from a distance, its similarities with both the F-22 and F-35 become striking when you come closer. The J-20's forward fuselage, particularly its angular nose, shows clear F-22 DNA, and the large air inlets on either side share strong design cues with the F-35. In an overall sense, the J-20 appears to leverage the Lockheed Martin approach to low observable design and an overall shape that was informed, if not directly inspired by, the MiG-144 program. This is the point in conversations about the J-20 where people will argue that those similarities that we see are not based on theft, but rather on function. There are only so many ways to design a stealth fighter, after all. But the truth is, stealth aviation isn't necessarily as limiting as some of these analysts would have you believe. After all, the F-35 and the F-22 do look quite a bit similar, but that's because they came from the same firm and were built at around the same time. But when considering other American stealth fighter entries that didn't make it into production for one reason or another, jets like Northrop's YF-23 or Boeing's X-32, it becomes pretty evident that there's more than one way to skin the low observable cat. But to be clear, similarities alone aren't necessarily evidence of anything. But when you consider China's known history for stealing or purchasing aircraft designs, and the fact that a Chinese national was arrested in 2014 for providing blueprints to these American aircraft to the Chinese government, the same year the Chinese government made significant changes to the J-20's design, the pile of coincidences starts to get high enough that you have to question whether or not they're coincidence at all. As I explained on Twitter a few weeks back, if your lawnmower gets stolen and you just accuse your neighbor of stealing it, that kind of makes you a jerk. But if your lawnmower gets stolen and you know your neighbor deals in stolen lawnmowers, and then you see him using a lawnmower that looks exactly like your lawnmower, it might warrant asking a few questions. Or, in the case of the J-20, it might be more apt to say if your lawnmower gets stolen and your neighbor's lawnmower gets stolen, and then you see the guy across the street using a lawnmower that's very clearly made out of parts from your two lawnmowers, you could be forgiven for thinking something fishy might be going on. But if I'm really starting to convince you here, I want to rein it in a bit, because this isn't a hard truth, this is a good possibility. After all, we're talking about taking information from unreliable sources and using it to substantiate conclusions we're drawing about other unreliable sources. But these looming questions and the skepticism we have to keep with us is part of why I love defense technology analysis. It is a never-ending mystery unraveling before our very eyes. There's always a bit of information that's just beyond reach. There's always something hidden. The best that we can do is draw good evidence-based conclusions, but then be willing to change our position when new evidence arises. Legendary granddaddy of aviation and famed Lockheed engineer Kelly Johnson's got a ton of great quotes all throughout his book More Than My Fair Share of It All. But the one that has always stuck with me, the one I keep on a sign in my office, is the measure of an intelligent person is the ability to change his mind. So did China really steal its first stealth fighter? The answer is hazy. It does certainly seem as though China either stole or borrowed elements of their J-20 design, but there's much more to developing a stealth fighter than getting your hands on blueprints or buying parts from another nation. China certainly had to do a fair amount of R&D themselves. In fact, they're still doing it when it comes to the engine. But when you consider China's well-documented history of espionage and technological theft, you have to wonder to yourself how the world's first non-American stealth fighter emerged from Chinese factories looking like Moscow somehow hired Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works to fix a defunct MiG program. And with the J-31 now cruising toward production and looking like yet another lost Lockheed cousin, this is a conversation we'll probably end up having again. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. If you want me to do a video all about Kelly Johnson being an incredible engineer, I'd love to, so let me know. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.